A Bedouin teenager named Muhammad Ejdib was searching for a lost goat along the cliffs above the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a crack in the rock, expecting to hear it clatter against stone. Instead, he heard pottery shatter. Inside that cave, sealed in clay jars, wrapped in linen, coated in a black tar-like resin, were scrolls that had been lying in the dark for 2,000 years. Nobody had touched them since the Roman Empire was still expanding. The leather was still flexible, the ink was still black, the Hebrew letters were still legible enough to read out loud. He'd been down there for 20 centuries, and he wasn't alone. What has been pulled out of those cliffs over the last 75 years doesn't just rewrite what we know about a desert, it rewrites what we know about the Bible, about how it was copied, about who copied it, about what else they were writing that never made it into your Bible, and about what a group of men living in a compound in the Judean wilderness believed was about to happen to them and wrote down, in detail, before it happened exactly the way they said it would. The oldest copy of the book of Isaiah on earth, 24 feet long, 1,000 years older than anything scholars had ever seen. Fragments of every book of the Old Testament except one. A scroll made of hammered copper that lists 64 buried treasures nobody has ever found. Hymns written by a man who believed he had seen the end of the world. Roman arrowheads embedded in the ground where the people who wrote those scrolls were slaughtered. And a rulebook for a community that had, according to its own documents, deliberately hidden its entire library for a generation that had not yet been born. This is the story of what's really in the caves above the Dead Sea, and by the end of it, you'll understand why the single most unsettling thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls isn't in a cave at all. It's a verse, written 600 years before those scrolls were sealed in their jars, that describes exactly what was done with them, why it was done, and who it was done for. The Bible didn't just survive in that desert. The Bible told them to put it there. To understand why the Dead Sea Scrolls exist at all, you have to start with the geography, because there is no other place on the surface of this planet where this could have happened. The Dead Sea sits at 1,412 feet below sea level. It is the lowest exposed land on Earth. The air pressure down there is measurably higher than at sea level. The water is nearly 10 times saltier than the ocean, so saturated that nothing lives in it. No fish, no algae, no bacterial mats. It is called the Dead Sea because it is, in the most literal sense available to the language, dead. The cliffs above it are worse. The Judean desert receives about 2 inches of rain a year. Relative humidity inside the limestone caves along the northwestern shore hovers at around 20% year-round, and has done so continuously for the last several thousand years. The caves are shaded from direct sun. The temperature is stable. The salt in the air is antimicrobial, and there is no groundwater seepage because there is no groundwater. Parchment, which is animal skin, scraped, stretched, and dried, is destroyed by exactly 3 things: moisture, microbial activity, ultraviolet light. The Qumran caves have none of them. In other words, the cliffs above the Dead Sea are a vault, a bone-dry, lightless, sterile, pressure-stable vault that has been running continuously since before the pyramids. Anything organic that goes into it doesn't rot, it doesn't mold, it doesn't get eaten, it just sits there, exactly the way it was left, sometimes for millennia. Now hold that thought, because everywhere else in the ancient Near East, this is the opposite of what happens. Ancient Jewish communities didn't archive their sacred texts, they buried them. When a scroll wore out, it was placed in a genizah, a storage room, and eventually interred in the ground, out of reverence, and it dissolved. That's why, before 1947, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible in existence was the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex, copied by scribes in the 10th and 11th centuries of the Common Era. Read that again. Before 1947, the oldest Hebrew Bible we had was younger than the Norman conquest of England. Everything scholars believed about how the Bible had been transmitted across 1,000 years of hand-copying every theory, every reconstruction, every argument about corruption and drift and scribal error was built on manuscripts written closer to our time than to Moses. And then a kid threw a rock into a hole in a cliff. Let's start with what was actually inside the jars. Between 1947 and 1956, 11 caves in the cliffs around Qumran were emptied, some by Bedouin, some by archaeologists, frequently by both, racing each other. When the dust settled, the count stood at roughly 900 separate manuscripts, represented by somewhere north of 15,000 fragments, some the size of a tablecloth, most the size of a fingernail. They date, by carbon, 1-4 analysis and paleographic examination, from approximately the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. That's the number that matters. That's the number that stopped the field cold. Because among those manuscripts were copies of the Hebrew Bible, not commentaries, not quotations, actual copies, and they contained fragments of every single book of the Old Testament except the book of Esther. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, 33 separate copies of Deuteronomy alone. The Psalms, 36 copies. Isaiah, 21 copies. Kings, Samuel, Job, Ruth, Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, the minor prophets. All of it, or nearly all of it, sitting in clay jars in the desert, written by hand, more than 1,000 years before the oldest Bible anyone had ever held. And then there was Cave 1 and the scroll that came out of it. The Great Isaiah Scroll is 17 sheets of parchment sewn end to end. It is 24 feet long and about 10 inches tall. It contains all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah. It was copied by a single scribe working in a scribal hand, consistent with the 2nd century BCE, around 125 BCE. It is the oldest complete copy of any biblical book in existence. And here is where it gets genuinely strange. When scholars unrolled it and understand the anticipation here, because everybody in the room knew what they expected to find, they expected drift. They expected 1,000 years of manual copying, scribe to scribe to scribe, to have produced exactly what 1,000 years of manual copying always produces: accumulated error, skipped lines, doubled words, marginal notes absorbed into the text, theological softening. This is not a controversial expectation. It is what happens to every long-transmitted manuscript tradition on Earth, from Homer to Beowulf. That is not what they found. The Great Isaiah Scroll and the Masoretic text of Isaiah, the version in essentially every Bible printed today, standardized by scribes 1,000 years later, are, across 66 chapters, substantially the same document. The overwhelming majority of variation is spelling, word order, grammatical particles, the kind of differences you'd get between a British and American edition of the same novel. The most quoted example is Isaiah chapter 53, the suffering servant passage, one of the most theologically loaded chapters in the Hebrew Bible. It runs 166 words. Between the Qumran scroll and the medieval Masoretic text, 17 letters differ. 10 are spelling, 4 are stylistic, 3 are the addition of the word light. None of them change the meaning of a single sentence. 1,000 years. Thousands of individual acts of copying by hundreds of men across the collapse of the Second Temple, the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman diaspora, the rise of Byzantium. The Arab conquest, and the text came out the other end essentially unchanged. There is no other document in human history with a transmission record like that. Not one. Now look at how they were written, because the physical evidence is its own story. Roughly 90% of the scrolls are in Hebrew. Not the Hebrew of everyday first-century speech that was Aramaic, but literary, scriptural Hebrew, deliberately maintained as a sacred language centuries after ordinary people had stopped using it at home. Some scrolls go further and use Paleo-Hebrew, the older angular script that had been obsolete for hundreds of years, reserved specifically for writing the divine name. Scribes would write an entire scroll in standard square script, and then, when they reached the 4 letters of the name of God, switch alphabets mid-sentence. They were, in other words, treating certain letters as too holy to write the normal way. About 5% are in Aramaic, the working language of the region, the language spoken in the streets of Judea, the language Jesus of Nazareth would have spoken. These include translations, apocalyptic visions, and an Aramaic retelling of Genesis. And a small handful are in Greek, which should not be there. Greek is the language of the Hellenistic occupier, the language of the Septuagint, the language of the empire that the people at Qumran seem to have despised. And yet, Greek fragments of Leviticus, Greek fragments of Exodus, a Greek scroll of the Minor Prophets recovered from a cave in Nahal Hever, a few miles south. The overwhelming majority are written on parchment-treated animal skin, mostly sheep and goat, and analysis of the DNA in that parchment has told us something nobody expected. Some of the skins came from animals that could not have been raised in the Judean desert. They came from elsewhere, which means the scrolls, or at least the materials, were being brought in from somewhere else. A minority, around 15%, are on papyrus, imported from Egypt. And one is not on either. We'll come back to that one, because it's the single most inexplicable object recovered from any of the 11 caves, and 80 years later nobody has a satisfying answer for it. Handwriting analysis has identified somewhere in the region of 500 distinct scribal hands across the collection. 500 individual people. 500 separate men, sitting in lamplight, holding a reed pen, copying letter by letter, most of them writing texts they believed would outlast them. They were right about that. Here's what tends to get lost in the coverage. The biblical manuscripts are only about a quarter of the collection. The rest, the majority, are texts that no one in the modern world had ever read. There are rule books. The community rule, sometimes called the Manual of Discipline, is a governing constitution for a group that lived communally somewhere in this desert. It describes an initiation process lasting years. It describes a common purse members surrendered their property to the group. It describes ritual washing, shared meals, a hierarchy of seniority reviewed annually, and a disciplinary code so specific it is almost uncomfortable to read. Falling asleep during an assembly, 30 days penance. Interrupting another member, 10 days. Gesturing with the left hand while speaking, 10 days. Laughing foolishly, 30 days. Slandering another member, 1 year, and permanent demotion. There are hymns. The Thanksgiving hymns, the Hodayo, are 18 columns of first-person poetry written by someone who is not named anywhere in the text and who has never been identified. He describes being persecuted, betrayed by his own community, driven into exile. He describes being given direct knowledge of divine mysteries. The community that preserved these hymns referred to a figure they called only the teacher of righteousness, and they believed God had revealed to him the true meaning of every prophecy in Scripture. We do not know his name. We have never found his grave. We have, apparently, his poetry. There are apocalyptic visions, detailed ones, texts describing the movements of angels, the architecture of a temple that has never been built, calendars organized around a 364-day solar year that put this community permanently and deliberately out of sync with the temple in Jerusalem, which is not a minor detail, because it means they were celebrating Passover on a different day than everyone else in Judaism, on purpose, as a statement. And there are texts that read, to anyone raised in a Christian context, like something they shouldn't be reading. The community rule describes a group that called themselves the Sons of Light. It describes a leader who was a teacher. It describes ritual immersion in water for the forgiveness of sins. It describes a communal meal of bread and wine, blessed by a priest, eaten in anticipation of a messianic age. It quotes Isaiah 40, "A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord," and applies it to itself, to a community living in the actual wilderness, roughly 9 miles from where the Gospels place John the Baptist. The scholarly consensus is careful here, and it should be. There is no evidence that John the Baptist or Jesus of Nazareth ever set foot in Qumran. None. The parallels are real. The causal link is not established, but the parallels are real. And that is the actual revolution of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the thing that genuinely reorganized 2 entire academic fields overnight. Before 1947, the standard picture of first-century Judaism was tidy. There was normative Judaism, and then Christianity broke off from it. Clean, sequential, easy to teach. The scrolls detonated that. What they revealed was a first-century Judaism that was wildly, chaotically diverse, competing sects, competing calendars, competing messiahs, competing versions of the biblical text itself, circulating simultaneously. Christianity didn't emerge from a monolith. It emerged from a religious environment that was already fracturing in a dozen directions. And many of the ideas that Christians have understood for 2,000 years as uniquely and originally Christian were being written down in Hebrew in a desert compound by Jewish men before Jesus was born. Which raises the obvious question. If that was in the caves, why did it take 40 years before anyone was allowed to read it? Here's the part the documentaries tend to skip. In 1953, an international team of 8 scholars was assembled to publish the material from Cave 4, the Mother Lode, roughly 15,000 fragments representing something like 600 separate manuscripts, the single richest cave in the entire collection. 8 men, 15,000 fragments. They were given exclusive access. The arrangement was that no one outside the team could publish, cite, or in most cases even see the unpublished material. Photographs were kept in a locked safe. Access required the permission of the team's editor-in-chief. Scholars who requested it were, with striking consistency, refused. The team published its first volume in 1955. By 1990, 35 years later, the vast majority of Cave 4 remained unpublished. Members of the original team had died and willed their assignments to their students, like property. Some scholars sat on the same handful of fragments for their entire careers. The editor-in-chief, in an interview with an Israeli newspaper in 1990, referred to the scrolls as belonging to my team. When challenged about the delay, the standard answer was that the work was slow, the fragments were fragile, and outsiders wouldn't understand. The scholarly community began, not unreasonably, to lose its mind. By the late 1980s, the phrase, the academic scandal par excellence of the 20th century, was appearing in print. Theories multiplied, and this is the point at which the Dead Sea Scrolls stop being a story about archaeology and start being a story about suppression. The Vatican was involved, people said. Something in Cave 4 threatened the foundations of Christianity, people said. The delay wasn't incompetence, people said. It was containment. The official explanation was, and remains, that it was simply scholarly dysfunction. 8 men, a monopoly, no deadline, no oversight, and the natural human tendency to sit on a treasure rather than share it. That explanation is probably true. It is also true that for 4 decades, the oldest Bible on earth was locked in a safe, and the only people permitted to read it were 8 men who would not say what was in it. It broke in 1991. The Huntington Library in California, which held a complete set of backup photographs made in the 1960s in case of war, announced without warning that it would make them available to any qualified scholar who asked. A team at Hebrew Union College published a reconstructed text generated from a concordance. A 2-volume facsimile edition appeared. The monopoly collapsed in a matter of months, and the material was public. And when the world finally read Cave 4, after 40 years, after the conspiracy theories, after the accusations of Vatican suppression, what was in it? Biblical manuscripts, legal texts, calendars, hymns, commentaries, more of exactly what everyone already knew was there. There was no bombshell. There was no suppressed gospel. There was nothing that overturned Christianity, which, depending on your temperament, is either the boring end of a conspiracy theory or the single most interesting fact in this entire story. Because it means the men who sat on those fragments for 40 years weren't hiding anything. They just didn't want to let go. I told you we'd come back to the one that isn't written on skin or papyrus. In March 1952, archaeologists working Cave 3 found 2 rolls of oxidized copper sheet lying against the cave wall. Not in a jar, not wrapped in linen. Just lying there, corroded into a green-black cylinder, too brittle to unroll without shattering. It sat unopened for 4 years. Eventually, it was shipped to Manchester, England, where a professor built a custom machine to saw it lengthwise into 23 strips. What was engraved on the inside is unlike anything else recovered from any cave. The copper scroll is an inventory. It lists 64 locations. At each location, it describes buried treasure gold, silver, ritual vessels, and, in several entries, additional scrolls. It gives directions. Real ones. In the cistern, which is below the rampart, on the east side, in a place hollowed out of rock, 600 bars of silver. In the pit adjoining on the north, in a hole opening northward, and buried at its mouth. A copy of this document with an explanation and their measurements, and an inventory of each and everything. The totals, added up, come to something in the range of 26 tons of silver and 65 tons of gold. At current prices, that is a number with 10 digits in front of the decimal point. Now consider the medium. Everything else in these caves is on parchment and papyrus, organic, perishable, cheap. Someone took this specific document and had it hammered into sheet copper, which is expensive, difficult, and serves exactly one purpose. It does not decay. Copper is what you use when parchment is not permanent enough for you. Whoever wrote the copper scroll was not writing for their own generation. They were writing for a generation they expected to arrive after everything they knew had been destroyed. And here's what's strange. The Hebrew is wrong. The dialect is not the literary Hebrew of the other scrolls. It's closer to the Mishnaic Hebrew that appears a century later. The script is crude. There are Greek letters inserted, apparently at random, after 7 of the entries. Nobody has ever explained what they mean. And scattered through the text are cross-references to a second document, a duplicate inventory, with more precise measurements, which the scroll says is buried at one of the listed sites. That document has never been found. Neither has any of the treasure. Not one bar, not one vessel, not one coin. 64 locations, described in plain Hebrew, and after 70 years of searching by archaeologists, treasure hunters, and at least 2 well-funded private expeditions, nothing. The official position of most scholars is that the copper scroll is folklore, a legend, an imaginary treasure list, engraved in metal, hidden in a cave, for reasons the theory does not fully explain. The alternative position is that it is exactly what it appears to be, an emergency inventory of the treasury of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, engraved in the most permanent medium available, and hidden by people who knew with certainty that the temple was about to fall. Because it did, 8 years later. Among the 7 scrolls recovered from cave, one was a text now called the War Scroll. It is 19 columns long, and it is a military manual for the end of the world. It describes a final war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, lasting 40 years. It specifies the length of the trumpets. It specifies the inscriptions to be written on the standards of each division. It specifies the ages of the combatants, the formation of the infantry, the rotation of the cavalry, the prayers of the priests between engagements. It is not vague. It is not poetic. It reads like a staff officer's operations order for Armageddon, and it names the enemy. The Sons of Darkness, in the War Scroll, are led by a people called the Kittim. The Kittim are described as an empire from across the sea, ruled by a commander the text calls a king, whose army is organized in units under standards, whose soldiers sacrifice to their military insignia, and whose power at the moment of writing appears total. There is no serious ambiguity about who the Kittim are. They are Rome. The people at Qumran wrote, in detail, decades in advance, that Rome was coming for them and that it would be the end of the world as they understood it. In 68 CE, during the First Jewish-Roman War, the 10th Legion moved down the western shore of the Dead Sea. The site at Khirbet Qumran shows a destruction layer dating to precisely that year. The buildings were burned. There is a collapsed wall. And embedded in the ground around the settlement, archaeologists recovered Roman arrowheads, iron trilobate points, the standard issue of the Roman legions, the physical signature of a Roman assault. The community that spent generations writing about the war at the end of the world was erased by an army in an afternoon in the exact manner they had written down. They were right. They were completely right about the who and the what. The only thing they got wrong was that they thought they were going to win. But before the Legion arrived, and this is the detail that reframes everything, someone in that community climbed the cliffs behind the settlement, in the heat, carrying the entire library. Cave after cave. 11 of them, spread across a mile of vertical limestone. Some of the caves are so difficult to access that modern archaeologists needed ropes to reach them. They wrapped the scrolls in linen. They sealed them in jars. They coated the jars in resin. They stacked them in the dark. And then they went back down and died. Here's what most people don't realize. The caves never stopped producing. The Judean desert is riddled with them, hundreds, most never systematically explored, many accessible only by rappelling down a cliff face. And starting in 2017, the Israel Antiquities Authority launched a comprehensive survey of every cave in the desert, driven by an uncomfortable motive. Looters were getting there first, and the fragments were surfacing on the black market at 8-figure prices. The state's position was that if the material was coming out regardless, it should come out with archaeologists holding the trowel. In 2021, in a cave in Nahal Hever, known accurately as the Cave of Horror, they found the first new biblical scroll fragments recovered in 60 years. Roughly 80 pieces, fragments of the minor prophets, Zechariah and Nahum. And they are in Greek, a Greek translation, but with one detail that stops you cold. Every time the text reaches the divine name, the Greek stops, and the 4 letters of the name of God appear in Paleo-Hebrew script. The same scribal reverence, the same refusal. 2,000 years later, in a different language, in a different cave, by a different hand, the name is still too holy to translate. The fragments date to around the 2nd century CE. They belong to refugees from the Bar Kokhba revolt. Jewish families who fled into the desert to escape Roman reprisal climbed into a cave 400 feet up a sheer cliff and were besieged there by a Roman camp built directly above them on the cliff top. The Romans didn't need to assault the cave, they just waited. Archaeologists found 40 skeletons in that cave. That is why it has the name it has. In the same survey, in a different cave, they found a basket. A woven reed basket, complete, with its lid about a yard across, capable of holding perhaps 20 gallons. Empty. Radiocarbon dating returned a result of approximately 10,500 years. Let that number sit for a second, because it does not belong in this story. 10,500 years puts it in the pre-pottery Neolithic before writing, before the wheel, before agriculture had fully taken hold in the region, 4,000 years before the first stone of the first pyramid. It is the oldest intact woven basket ever found anywhere on Earth. Someone made it. Someone carried it into that cave. Someone set it down, with its lid on, and never came back for it. And the desert kept it, empty, waiting, for 10,500 years. Also recovered in that survey, a hoard of coins from the revolt. Arrowheads, sandals, a comb. And the mummified remains of a child, roughly 6 years old, wrapped in cloth, placed in a shallow pit, with 2 small stones laid on top. The desert doesn't distinguish between the sacred and the ordinary. It preserves the Word of God, and it preserves a basket, and it preserves a 6-year-old. It keeps everything. That's what a vault does. Which brings us to the thing I promised you at the start. Every part of this story has an explanation. The preservation is climate, the textual stability is scribal discipline. The embargo was academic dysfunction. The Kittim were an obvious guess. Rome was the superpower of the age. Predicting Roman aggression in 1st century Judea was not prophecy, it was the news. Fine. Take all of it. Explain every piece. There is one thing left, and it is not in a cave. The practice at the center of this entire story, the specific, peculiar act of taking a sacred document, sealing it inside a clay jar, and hiding it in the ground so that it would survive a coming catastrophe and be read by a generation that did not yet exist, is not an invention of the Qumran community. It is written in the Bible they were copying. Jeremiah, chapter 32. Around 587 BCE, roughly 400 years before the first scroll was sealed at Qumran, the Babylonian army is besieging Jerusalem. The city is going to fall. Everyone knows it. And in the middle of the siege, the prophet Jeremiah does something that reads, in context, as insane. He buys a field. He executes the deed in front of witnesses. And then he gives this instruction. Take these deeds, this sealed deed of purchase and this open deed, and put them in an earthenware jar that they may last for a long time. Put them in an earthenware jar that they may last for a long time. That is not a metaphor. That is not poetry. That is a procedure. It is the exact procedure that was performed on the cliffs above the Dead Sea, 4 centuries later, by men who had that verse in their library. We have found their copies of Jeremiah as the 10th Legion came down the western shore, and it doesn't stop there. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 8, the book they preserved best, the scroll that survived most completely, 24 feet of parchment, 66 chapters, letter for letter across 1,000 years. In the middle of it, this. Now go, write it before them on a tablet, and inscribe it in a book, that it may be for the time to come as a witness forever. Write it on a tablet, a permanent medium, and inscribe it in a book. 2 copies, one perishable, one permanent, for the time to come, as a witness forever. They found the copper scroll in Cave 3, and then there's Habakkuk. Among the 7 scrolls in Cave 1, the first cave, the goat, the rock, the shattered jar, was a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, the community's own line-by-line interpretation of the prophet, explaining what each verse really meant and applying it to their own time. Habakkuk chapter 2 opens like this: "Write the vision, make it plain upon tablets, so that a runner may read it. For the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come, it will not delay." Write the vision, make it plain. It is for an appointed time, still in the future. It will seem slow. Wait for it. It will not be late. The Qumran commentary on that passage survives. We can read what they thought it meant. And what they wrote, in their own hand, was that the appointed time had been extended, that it would take longer than anyone expected, and that the final generation, the one that would actually see the vision fulfilled, had not yet arrived. They wrote a commentary explaining that the text was waiting for a later generation. Then they sealed it in a jar. And it waited 2,000 years. Through the fall of the temple, the diaspora, the rise of Christianity, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, the Ottomans, the British Mandate, through the entire span of recorded Western history, in the dark, at 20% humidity, in a cave 400 feet up a cliff, until a kid looking for a goat threw a rock into a hole. The scrolls are real. The Isaiah scroll is real. You can walk into the shrine of the book in Jerusalem and stand 3 feet from it. The 1,000-year textual stability is real, and it is measurable, and it is documented. The 500 scribal hands are real. The community rule is real. The teacher of righteousness is real enough to have left poetry and not a name. The 40-year embargo is real. The copper scroll is real, and it is sitting in a museum in Amman, and its 64 treasures have never been found. The war scroll is real. The Kittim are real. The Roman arrowheads are real, and they are still in the ground at Khirbet Qumran, where the people who predicted them are buried. The Cave of Horror is real, and so are the 40 skeletons, and so is the child. The basket is real, and it is 10,500 years old, and it is empty. And Jeremiah 32-14 is real, Isaiah 30-8 is real, Habakkuk 2-3 is real. They were written centuries before the caves were filled, and they are, word for word, the operating instructions for what was done in them. Scholars will tell you, and they are right to tell you, that this is not prophecy. It is precedent. The men at Qumran read Jeremiah, and when Rome came, they did what Jeremiah did, because that is what you do with a text you love and a life you're about to lose. It is the least mysterious explanation available, and it is almost certainly the correct one. But hold the 2 things in your head at the same time and see if you can make them sit still. A book contains an instruction. Seal the words in a jar, because the vision is for a later generation, and it will seem slow, but it will not be late. 2,000 years later, that instruction was found sealed in a jar, in a cave, by a later generation. And it was very, very slow, and it arrived exactly on time. The desert is still full of caves. Most of them have never been entered. The Antiquities Authority is still rappelling down those cliffs, right now, this year, racing looters to whatever is still up there in the dark. Because whatever else the Dead Sea has taken from us, it has never once given anything back. It only holds it, and it is still, by every available measure, not finished waiting.